Okay, so we're watching the third season of The Guild this week, and also reading the comic book, The Guild. And the comic book, The Guild, is a prequel. So it's supposed to have taken place before the first season of The Guild actually started. And I'm assigning it this week because it actually was published at the same time that the third season of The Guild came out. And again, I find it really interesting how, excuse me, when you're dealing with online media and you're watching a set of directors and writers and producers put together online media, typically they're doing so from outside of the system. And so they start with a very low budget, and then the seasons, you can just watch the effect that the amount of money that comes in has on the quality of the seasons. And this is one of their most interesting seasons, I think. In no small part because Wil Wheaton becomes part of the season. And he, of course, is a name that is known to a lot of you. He is the guild leader, the axis of evil. And, of course, the season starts off with everyone waiting for the expansion of their game to come out so that they can start playing on the new level. We also see, again, the new intro, the new mediated intro to the series, and the quality goes up once again, even though we see that the avatars remain primarily the same. And of course, they're all decked out in their best garb that they have won by killing the most people that they can while playing the game. And so we see, in contrast to the original avatar that Codex comes up with in the comic book, I'm sorry. Yeah, in the comic book, where she just has on a simple white shift, we see her decked out in all of the gear that she has won, from her shoes to her armor to her necklace to her scepter that she has as a healer. And this is all just fascinating to me. Not only just how the game works itself, but how we can watch how the effect has on Codex's avatar, even though we're not watching her play the game itself. The mise-en-scène represents that. So I'm going to get back to editing here in just a second. But so what I wanted to do, first of all, is, again, draw your attention to how editing works within the Guild, the web series. Here we have a screenshot from the first scene that opens up the third season of the Guild, and this is a conversation between Vork and Codex. And just to go back, this is the original shot. You see Vork is on the right and Codex is on the left. That's her reaction shot to him. And you'll see that it's maintained throughout this scene, where Codex stays on the left and Vork is on the right every time he reacts to her. And so even with video series and online web art, creative endeavors, that they're relying on this language that has been established through what's called continuity editing, or was known as the Hollywood editing machine, is that we have these certain kinds of reactions and action shots, with point of view, with shot reverse shot, with match on action, these kinds of editing tricks that directors rely upon, that we still use today, and that we as viewers watch and maybe don't have a vocabulary for them until now, of course, because you're learning about it and you've read the website that I've assigned and looked at the examples. That this is how we as spectators read the language that is editing on screen, and then make the narrative make sense in our heads because of these tricks that they use. And these tricks are not things that are meant to, make us into dupes or whatever, but they're meant to make us accept that this time and space really exist in reality, and that we accept it as something that makes sense within our world, that makes sense within a certain time and place. Okay, so for this week we also read The Guild, the comic book, and I like to assign this for several reasons. One, the art is just fantastic. The work that's done by Jim Rugg and within the comic book is just engrossing to me. And also, I find it really interesting because we see several artistic representations of Codex or Sid, which is her real life name, and the rest of her crew within the comic book series. And we also get the backstory that leads up to the actual web series, which is also great. But one thing I want to draw your attention to here is I have two side-by-side images of both Sid and her avatar, and then her boyfriend. And these two representations are done by two different artists. And so even though it has a lot of the same mise-en-scène, we have her corset, which of course represents her femininity, kind of old school femininity. In one, she has her violin, which represents her artistic ability. And the other, she has her scepter, which represents her gaming capabilities. But she also always has her same, red hair. But nevertheless, like, these two characters look very, very different from one another. And that's shown through the artist's different capabilities and also interpretations of the storyline and of the people. And so as you're reading the comic book, I do want you to pay attention to the fact that there is about 10 different full-page artistic representations of the series that come at the chapter headings, and each one of those are done by a different artist. The artwork throughout the comic book is done by Jim Rugg, but there are other artists whose work is being represented, and that's why we see this really different kind of artistic kinds of expression throughout the series. And so do pay attention to that. Look at the artist's name and think about what each artist is accomplishing that is different, and how that visually impacts the way that we read and understand the story that's held within the comic book. Now, again, I wanted to take us back to some earlier terms that we talked about. This is a transmedia series. It started out just as a web series. Obviously, though it's on YouTube, it allows for fan interaction and navigability. But in addition to that, as the series progressed, they added the comic books, and also there were these live components to the series where the actors and would show up at various Comic Cons or various conferences that were dedicated to the gaming world and that were of interest to people who liked the Guild, and so there are these different levels in which the stories unfold, different platforms. As you remember from the definition of transmedia, it has to unfold at least 3 different platforms. And so we're getting into another one of the platforms this week with the comic book. I've only assigned one comic book to you. I hope you find it interesting enough that you go ahead and buy the other comic books for your own pleasure and amusement. Now, again, here in the comic book, we can see I've got some frames here from the comic book, and you can see how we can put into effect almost a lot of the same vocabulary that we've been using to talk about the web series and the video with the comic books. So comic books are a visual medium, and they also have frames like videos do. But videos, of course, on average have 28 frames per second that are passing in front of your eyes that make the motion appear to be nonstop and, something that's realistic and represents the real world. Whereas with comic books, you have just usually somewhere between 4 and 6, sometimes 8 frames per page. And each one of the frames visually communicates a lot of information to us. First of all, again, we have the mise-en-scène. We can see the band members here that look like they belong in a band, sort of the long hair, the shaggy hair. So he looks like he's in the FBI. The trucker's cap. All these are indicators that these are male members of our society who somehow view themselves as being rebels or rebellious, and that's in direct contrast to Sid here, of course, who is in her usual conservative attire. Also, we can see that they're young and that they're not engaging in sort of illegal behavior. Most of them, we have three people who are drinking beer. So that shows them as being a little bit more rebellious. But we also have like a milkshake container in front of Sid, which shows that she is more innocent. In contrast to these band members, there's also a beer bottle there though for her, so she kind of like walks in both worlds. Also, you can see how in each of these frames that we again move between an establishing shot here that shows where all of the actors are in relation to one another, that they're in a restaurant, gets us oriented. Then we have a clear shift here where Sid is alone in her apartment on the couch. She has a much more relaxed attitude. She's on the couch, not in a booth. And then we have some medium close-ups of her. And also, again, that gives us a lot of information. Sorry about that. Gives us a lot of information about her. Here we see that she is sleeping, but that the sunlight is pouring through the windows, and the clock says that it's 3 p.m. in the afternoon. So we can pretty much safely assume that she's depressed. And this is her state of mind before she learns about the game, as she calls it, which is known to be World of Warcraft. But, of course, due to trademark reasons, she's not allowed to use it. But I also want to pay attention to the size of the frames, because in comic books, the size of the frames also are a kind of language that speak to us. The smaller the frame is, typically it's supposed to represent a shorter time duration than the larger frames. So here we have 2 very small frames, 3 medium-sized frames, and 1 large frame. And what this is meant to convey is that this is like, a small snapshot in time, another small snapshot in time. And then this is a larger scene which would take longer time, even though reading the actual words pretty much is comparable. But we get this feeling of spaciousness from the larger frames that makes us assume that the time that's being represented, regardless of how long it takes us to read the words or to look at the graphics, is actually representing a longer time within the narrative. And so, of course, this frame down here represents the largest amount of time. Also, you can see here, like, this is a comic book representation of a montage. We just talked about montages in my last video about editing. And here, again, you see snippets of time that take place supposedly over months or years, and it's in this wheel, which kind of represents the whip pan again. And here we have the large frame that represents a certain amount of time. It's supposed to give us a sense of airiness, like Sid is sad. And then we have the close-ups of the pill bottles that brings our attention to the warnings. And then we have this sort of dream sequence where we see Sid imagining herself being sick. And you can tell this is a dream sequence because the image of her is surrounded in these little bubble shapes. And again, visually, how do you communicate information to your audience in visual mediums without actually writing down, this is a dream sequence? And you're going to want to be thinking about that as we start moving towards our final project, where you're going to be putting together visual images in order to communicate a narrative to your audience. So my next video, I'm going to be talking to you about what it is that you're going to be doing for your assignment this week. And it will be capitalizing on the editing terms that we've learned and the cinematography terms that we've learned, and also thinking about the Guild in a creative new way. So tune back in for your last and final video.